Hi Year 10. So this video is to accompany the webinar earlier. Some of you may realise again that I'm choosing to use a video rather than the direct recording from the webinar. And that's because our webinar earlier was a little bit disrupted with my poor internet connection and then us getting cut off a little bit earlier. And I thought actually what might be useful is if I take you through in a video, I can cover the stuff at the end of the webinar, and this way you can pause and go back, etc. if you need to. Now, just very quickly, if you didn't see the webinar, what was included were some polls to assess our knowledge as we went. So there will be some slides in here that say poll, but you don't have to worry about those because they're not for you. And I can't do a webinar, I can't do a video like this with polls in it. Now, the work that you will need to be doing this week to accompany this webinar will be the quiz. And you may want to re-watch this video or watch this video for the first time to do that quiz. In your second session, you will need to possibly go back to this video and just look at some specific parts and then complete the exam questions. And then there's an extension activity that I will show you at the end, which shows you how to write a good, accurate scientific method. So let's get started. I will make myself small again and let's go through what we need to. So the first things that we need to think about are what we know at the moment. Now, first of all, what I would like you to do is, after I've read these questions, I would like you to pause the video. I would like you to go away and have a go at answering these, and then come back when we have the answers. So first of all, what does rate mean? That can be with regard to a reaction, but it can also be just in general. What does rate mean? Number two, what are the signs? What are the things that we should look out for so that we can know that a chemical reaction is taking place? And lastly, how would you speed up a chemical reaction? Pause now and have a go at those tasks. Okay, welcome back. So let's go through the answers to those questions. The first one, what does rate mean? Well, rate is the speed at which something happens. It's how quickly something happens. What are the signs that a chemical reaction is taking place? Well, there are lots that you could write here, but some of the ones I want you to focus on. Bubbling. Bubbling or fizzing shows us that a gas is being produced, and that shows us that a new product is being made. A colour change means that some other product is being made with a different colour. A temperature change is to do with the overall energy change for a reaction, which again shows us that new things are being made. And that temperature change can be an increase in temperature or a decrease. And what we'll be talking about there is endothermic and exothermic reactions, and we'll go on to that in a later webinar. Another one that isn't on there is the reactions that are fluorescent or phosphorescent, and that means they give out light as they react. And that's really useful with certain chemicals and certain products. So for example, in fireworks, when they are ignited and they're given that energy to get started, they react and the way that we can tell that they're reacting is that they are giving out light. And that's really useful in a firework, isn't it? Because that's how we know, well, that's why we use them for fireworks, because they're beautiful. Now lastly, one that people tend not to remember so well, is precipitation. And a precipitation reaction is one where you would react two liquids, two solutions, and you would form a solid. And this solid would be insoluble. And the way that you would see that directly is that you would see a solution going from clear to cloudy. And that can be really useful because we can look at how quickly it becomes cloudy, and that can tell us some information about rates of reaction. So today we're going to look at collision theory. We're going to look at how to increase the rate of a reaction, how to measure it practically, and then how to work it out from a graph. So the first thing we need to be aware of is what collision theory actually is. Now, in order for a chemical reaction to take place, particles need to collide. And not only do they need to collide with sufficient energy to make the reaction happen. So a proper definition of what collision theory is that chemical reactions can only occur when reacting particles collide with each other and with sufficient energy. It's important to note, Year 10, that particles collide all the time. Okay, particles move randomly and they bump into each other. But that doesn't always result in a successful collision, because a successful collision means that the particles need to have enough energy. And particles will have a range of energy normally. So if you can increase the frequency of collisions, and you can increase how much energy those particles have, then you're likely to increase the amount of those collisions that will be successful and that will result in a chemical reaction. Now, what is that sufficient energy? Well, we need to know it in a very specific way, and we're going to call it activation energy. And the activation energy is the amount of energy required to get a reaction going. Now, if you look at the graph on the screen itself, you can see that this reaction actually has an overall lowering of energy as it goes on. Now, this means that normally you'd think you wouldn't need to give it any energy to get it started anyway, but you do. Now here, what we can see, is that there is this bump. And this bump is known as the activation energy. It's the hump you need to get over to get the reaction going and to get the reaction started. And so if that's the amount of energy particles need in order to have a successful collision, well, that's the amount of energy we want to give them, hopefully, to ensure that they can react successfully. Now, how do we increase the rate of a reaction? Well, in general, to speed up a reaction, we need to do one of three things. The first thing we can do is we can increase the energy of the particles colliding. So we can make sure that each of those particles has more energy to begin with. And normally, that's kinetic energy and is to do with how quickly they're travelling. The second thing we can do is we can increase the frequency of those collisions. So we can make those collisions happen more often. And that can be to do with making the space they're in smaller. It can be to do with introducing more particles. It can be to do with making more available particles there to react. And the third thing we can do is a mixture of the two. So when we talk about increasing rate of reaction, we need to talk about increasing collisions and increasing the energy of those collisions. So now we're going to go through the different ways to increase the rate. Now, as I go through these 5 ways, I know it says 4, but it is 5, think about how you might revise this. Because in general, the best way to revise this is by doing a flashcard for each of these 5. It might be, as you watch this video, you choose to get your flashcards ready and start now. That's absolutely fine. So, let's go through each of these individually. Temperature. When I increase temperature, I increase the frequency of the collisions and I make those collisions more energetic. Because I do those two things, there are more successful collisions and therefore the overall rate of reaction increases. So let's think about what that means. By giving those particles more energy, so transferring energy from a heat store to a kinetic energy store, I make them move around more. I make them move more and more quickly, which means they bump into each other more. And because they're moving more quickly, when they do bump into each other, they bump into each other with far more energy than they would have done previously. If they're bumping into each other more, they're colliding more, and those collisions are more energetic, then more of those collisions will result in chemical reactions. And so therefore the overall speed of the reaction, the rate of reaction, will increase. The 2 diagrams on the bottom just explain how that works. The graph on the left shows you that at a higher temperature, you have a higher percentage of molecules at or above the activation energy. And that activation energy is just shown by that letter A. Now this diagram doesn't really come up too much in your GCSE. It's more of an A-level diagram, an energy level diagram, but it is still important, I think, that you can interpret those, especially as you guys are going to be sitting the higher paper, and we don't know what the examiner is going to throw at us. And we have to be able to look at something and to work out exactly what it shows us. So, the next thing we need to look at is surface area to volume ratio. Now, surface area to volume ratio is another way of increasing the rate of reaction. Now, on this slide, there are 2 things that we're going to go through separately. So on the left is just how we calculate that. Now, the furthest left block you can see is a block where each of the sides are 1 centimetre long. Now the surface area for that block, which means the total area of all the sides added together, is 6 centimetres. And that's because the area of each side is 1 times 1, which is 1. And then you add each of the sides together, so that's 1 times 1 times 1 times 1, 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, which is 6. That's a weird way of doing it. So the surface area is 6 centimetres squared. The volume of that block is 1 centimetres cubed. And that's because you do height times depth times width, or length, or whatever. And so you get a volume of 1. Now that means the ratio is 6 to 1. Now if I go to the slightly bigger block, you will see that the surface area in this case is 24. Now that's because the area of one of the faces of the cube is 2 times 2, which is 4. And then you're going to add each of the 6 faces together because it's a cube, so you get 24. The volume is 8 because 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. So in this case, when we simplify that ratio, we get a surface area to volume ratio of 3 to 1. The largest cube, I'll let you work out exactly how they got to those measurements on your own, but the largest cube has the smallest surface area to volume ratio of 2 to 1. Now what does that mean? Well, firstly, in the exam, you must be aware of what surface area to volume ratio means, and that is simply that. The second thing you need to do is to understand the relationship between surface area to volume ratio and rate of reaction. Now, the way I like to think about this, Year 10, is I like to think of it in terms of sugar for my tea. Because I'm a simple person with simple pleasures, and it seems like the easiest thing for me to get my head around, and it may be for you too. So on the right hand side of this screen, you will see a block that says slow next to it. Now this block has what we would call a low surface area to volume ratio. It's a solid block, and if I pop that sugar cube, block of sugar, into my tea, it's going to dissolve, but it's going to do so slowly. And the reason it's going to dissolve slowly is because the only bits of sugar, the only particles of sugar that can dissolve in my tea are the ones on the very outside of that block. They're the only ones available to react. Now, once they've reacted, you expose more sugar underneath, and therefore those can react after. But it's slow, it takes time. The second diagram, if you see the arrow and then it moves forward, you can see that block has been cut in half. The volume is the exact same, but this time there is a greater surface area because you've exposed 2 new surfaces. Now, all of those particles on those 2 new surfaces on the inside that you've exposed here are available to react. And so therefore, these are going to dissolve quicker than this. That increases. And if you were to cut that big block into lots of smaller blocks, again, the volume is the exact same. It's the same amount of sugar. These are going to react much more quickly. They're going to dissolve far more quickly. And that's because they have far more particles available to react than the first block did. And this has a far higher surface area to volume ratio. They have the same volume, but this surface area is larger. A good way to remember this is if the particle is smaller, or the pieces are smaller, then the surface area is larger. Another way to increase surface area is you can increase the amount of folds and the amount of shapes in it. So, for example, in your small intestines, you have something called villi, which are shaped like this, and they run the whole way on the inside of your intestines, and that increases the surface area of your intestines. Another 2 diagrams here to help you understand that are here, and they just show you that at any one time, the particles on the outside of the bit, are the only ones that can react. And so therefore, if you chop it up into smaller bits, you have more particles available to react at any one time, which means you're going to get a quicker reaction. And so to summarise, a model answer for that would be increasing surface area to volume ratio increases the number of particles available to react at any time. This increases the frequency of collisions and therefore the successful collisions, hence rate of reaction increases. So more collisions. We're not talking about energy of particles here, we are talking about increasing the number of particles that are available to collide. So more collisions, therefore more successful collisions and a greater rate of reaction. Now the next thing we need to look at is pressure. And pressure is simply about bringing those particles closer together. And we're talking about gases here. We'll talk about concentration in a second, because you don't have concentration of gases, you call it pressure. And pressure here, we're talking about a smaller area with the same number of particles. When I decrease the amount of space those particles have, I actually increase the pressure. And all of those particles get closer together. The closer they are together, the more likely they are to collide. So you see a greater number of collisions, so a higher frequency of collisions. If there are more collisions, you have a greater chance of those collisions being successful, and therefore the rate of reaction increases. Concentration. Now, concentration is very similar to pressure, but this time we're talking about it in solution. So if there are more particles in a given volume of solution, particles will collide more frequently. This means successful collisions increases, and therefore rate of reaction does too. So let's look at the first diagram up here. If you imagine that the blue circles are water and the red is a reactant that's going to react with the water, the rate of reaction is going to be slower here because there are fewer particles per given volume of water. But the rate of reaction here will be higher, and that's because you've got more particles available to react, and so the reaction is going to happen more quickly. Think about it in terms of squash. So a concentrated solution, like this one here, has more squash per unit of water than a dilute solution does. A concentrated solution has an increased rate of reaction because you see more collisions. Again, we are not talking about energy of collisions here, we are just talking about the number of collisions in itself. Now, the last of the 5 I want to go through is catalysts. Now, catalysts are chemicals that speed up the rate of reaction. They are added to a substance, and rather than being involved in the reaction itself, they're just there to make it go quicker. And actually, catalysts are great because you can add them to a solution and they will speed up the reaction, and at the end you can get your catalyst back, and you can then use that catalyst again and again. I mentioned this in the webinar, but if any of you are looking to go into a future in research science and in chemistry, a really, really well-paid area, if you want to make a big discovery, if you can find a really good catalyst for a reaction that's used in industry widely, that's cheap enough, and it can be used in lots of reactions, you're going to be minted, okay? Because catalysts are used by almost every chemical industry to make the reactions happen quicker. Because the quicker they happen, the less time they're waiting for their product to be made, and therefore the more money they're going to make. Now, how does this actually happen? Well, there is a phrase here that if you are doing your flashcards, you need to make sure you've got down word for word. Catalysts increase the rate of a reaction by providing an alternative pathway with a lower activation energy. So they decrease the activation energy overall. So, a little bit more detail about a catalyst. It speeds up the rate of reaction. It doesn't alter the products of a reaction. So if you use a catalyst or you don't use a catalyst, you still end up with the same stuff. In fact, you still end up with the same amount of stuff. It just takes a lot longer to get there. The catalyst itself is not chemically changed in the reaction, and it doesn't get used up. And I totally get that might seem a bit bizarre. Catalysts are a bit bizarre in some ways, but that's what you need to know. Now, you don't need to know this next bit for your GCSE, but I just think it helps a little bit to understand it. So, really common types of catalysts are enzymes, which you have in your body, without which you wouldn't be able to survive. Acid-base catalysts, which catalyse reactions that involve acids and bases. And heterogeneous catalysts. Now, these are catalysts that the reactants kind of get stuck to, and it brings them closer together, and they react more. Now, that's just to give you some background info. Again, you will not be examined upon that in your GCSE. So, here is our model answer and graph about activation energy and catalysts. Now, just as a heads up, I have seen these graphs in exams that they ask you to label the parts, including labelling the activation energy. We will do more on these graphs when we look at endothermic and exothermic reactions in the coming weeks. So, if you look at the graph, the blue line shows the activation energy if this reaction didn't have a catalyst in it. And you can see it's far higher. Now, if the energy is higher, there are going to be fewer particles at that higher energy. However, with a catalyst, you reduce that activation energy. So you're going to find that more particles are going to be at or above the activation energy when you have a catalyst in that reaction. If more particles are at or above that activation energy, then you're going to have more successful collisions and an increased rate of reaction. Now again, if you're doing flashcards, the diagram and that model answer are really important. Now I often don't talk about learning things off by heart in chemistry, because chemistry is a lot about applying your knowledge. But when we talk about rates of a reaction, there are some really important definitions that you do just need to know, and this is one of them. So, we have talked about the different ways that you can increase a rate of a reaction. If you are still stuck, can I suggest you go back in this video and re-watch the portions that you are confused about. Some of the questions in your task at the end relate specifically to different factors that can increase a rate of a reaction. So do go back and look back on that if you need to. The next thing we're going to look at is how we can practically monitor the rate of a reaction. So what do I actually do to measure it? Well, the first thing you need to be aware of is a graph that looks like this. And I'm just going to move myself out of the way for a second. Now this graph is really common in an exam, and it shows you the mass or volume of a product, so how much stuff is being made, and down here shows you the time. So as time increases, as time goes on in a reaction, how much product are we making? Now what you need to see first of all is that it starts in the exact same place and it ends in the exact same place, and that's really, really important in a reaction, rate of reaction graph. It starts in the same place because before the reaction you don't have any product, which is true of every reaction. And it ends in the same place because if I add a certain amount of reactant A and a certain amount of reactant B, regardless of the conditions, eventually I am going to make the same amount of product. But it's how quickly I get there. And you'll notice that this pink or purpley line here is your faster reaction. And you can see that it's faster because it reaches the total yield, the total amount of product it's going to make, more quickly than the slower reaction does. A quick way of looking at this is the line with the steeper gradient is the one that shows the faster rate of reaction. And that is true of every rate graph, so it is important to know that. Now in terms of the maths, if the exam said, and there are questions on the quiz for you to have a go at with this sort of calculation in it, and it said, how do you calculate the mean rate of a reaction? Well, there are two ways to do that. The first thing you could do is you could look at your amount of product being used up, and you could say, well, the amount that's being used up divided by the amount of time taken for it to be used up is the rate of a reaction. So if more reactant got used up in a shorter amount of time, that's going to be a quicker rate than if it was less being used up. The other way, and if I'm being honest, the more common way to measure it is the amount of product formed. So often this is with a gas. And you can see how much product is being formed in a given amount of time, or how long it takes for a certain amount of product to be formed. And that will show you your rate of reaction as well. So let's look at some experimental methods that you might be able to do this with. Now, first thing I'm just going to say, Year 10, is that Miss Yarvi is in the process of making an amazing video about these practicals, and there are really good practical videos online for you to see them in action. You should have done one or two of these yourselves in class if you got onto this, okay? But if not, don't worry, we will go over them as they are required practicals. So the first way, on the top left, is you can use a delivery tube and an upturned measuring cylinder to catch and collect a gas that's made in a reaction. We can look at how much gas is made in a certain amount of time, or we could try and obtain a certain amount of gas and see how long it takes to get there. The diagram on the bottom right is basically the exact same idea, only this time, rather than your delivery tube taking you to an upturned cylinder, this time you attach a gas syringe. And what a gas syringe does is it collects the gas and the plunger is pushed out as more gas is collected. And you can read off the amount of gas. So I could say, right, for both practicals, I want to measure how much gas is made in 2 minutes. And then I could record that and change the concentration or change the size of the, if I'm doing marble chips in there, I could change the size of the marble chips and see what happens. Now, another way to do this is by looking at a precipitation reaction. So this is a reaction with sodium thiosulfate and hydrochloric acid. And what you start with is one of the products in a conical flask with an X drawn on a piece of paper that you've put below it. before you, just as you add your second product, you're going to start your stopwatch. Sorry, you add your second reactant, you're going to start your stopwatch. Now this reaction is a precipitation reaction. So what happens is your solution gets more and more cloudy. And you stop your stopwatch when you can no longer see the cross at the bottom through your solution. And that shows you how quickly the precipitate is being formed. And you could repeat that reaction with different concentrations to see if there is a different speed. Now, the issue with this way, first of all, it's very simple, it's very easy, so those are the positives, but it requires humans to make a judgment, and that means that there is some human error in there. I may decide that I can no longer see the cross slightly before somebody else, and that even small discrepancy can lead to an inaccuracy in your results. The last one, which is one that's really easy to do, and this is the one we normally do when we're trying to compare the effects of surface area to volume ratio, is we can record the mass of the reactant as the reaction goes on. So here you can see that we're reacting marble chips and hydrochloric acid. And what we're doing here is we're seeing how much the mass of this setup decreases as the reaction progresses. Now this reaction is one where a gas is made, and that gas is going to escape through the cotton wool into the atmosphere. And so it appears like you're losing mass, but you're not, you're just making a gas that's going elsewhere. You're not actually, getting rid of anything as such. But you can see how quickly your reactants are being used up and converted into products. And you could do that with different size marble chips and compare how quickly it took for the mass to decrease by half, for example. Or you could let them both react for 5 minutes and see what the end mass was in each case. That cotton wool is there to stop any spray of acid. Okay, sometimes these reactions can be quite vigorous, especially if you use a strong acid and very small marble chips. Then you're going to have quite a vigorous reaction, lots of bubbling, and you don't want to lose any acid, because if acid spits out, it's going to make your results unreliable again, because it's going to look as if you've lost lots of reaction mass due to the actual reaction itself, when actually you will have just lost it because it spilled over the sides. Now, this is the bit that if you watch the webinar live that I got rudely cut off and couldn't finish. So let me go through this bit with you, which is really frustratingly probably one of the most difficult bits of what I wanted to do with you today. So, this is an example of an exam question. Now, in your exams, Year 10, what you need to be really aware of is that 30% of your marks are going to come from questions where they assess your maths skills. And that's not because science is becoming maths, it's because science has always been maths. And because as scientists, if we can prove things numerically, it's a lot better, okay? You get a more accurate answer. So we do like maths in science, okay? But the maths isn't hard. And in this case, it's very simple. Now I'm going to show you 2 examples of how they can ask you to interpret a graph about rates of reaction. And what you need to be careful of is the wording in the question. So this question asks you to calculate the mean rate of reaction after 20 seconds. So it's saying, in that first 20 seconds, what was the average rate of reaction? Now, that's quite easy to do. And what you need to do is firstly go to your graph at 20 seconds, measure up to the line and along, and you will see you've got 36 centimetres cubed of gas. So that's the first thing you do. Now, in an exam, you're going to want to draw those lines on, okay? Because drawing those lines on shows the examiner that you at least know what you're doing. And actually, in the mark scheme, they say to us as markers, give them a mark if they've drawn those lines correctly, even if they haven't written it properly in the working out section. So what you've done there is you've said, right, after 20 seconds, 36 centimetres cubed of gas have been produced. Now, if we go back to what we wrote down earlier about how to calculate the mean rate of reaction, you'll remember that one way we could do it was by looking at the quantity of product formed divided by time. And we've just got that from our graph really easily. We knew it was at 20, we went up to 20, we read it across. So let's put the numbers in. So 36 centimetres cubed divided by 20 seconds gives us an answer of 1.8 centimetres cubed per second. Now we get the units here from whatever our starting units were. So centimetres cubed divided by seconds will give you centimetres cubed per second as a unit. That that is how to calculate mean rate of reaction. And that is something that you are expected to do on both the foundation and the higher papers. However, for higher, and you'll see that I've put a little H just there, just to prove that this is higher only content, you are sometimes asked to calculate the rate at a specific time. So rather than saying something like the rate up to 20 seconds or from 20 seconds, you are asked at 20 seconds. So at specifically 20 seconds, what's the rate? Now, the reason they can ask you this question is because rates of reaction graphs are curved. If there was a straight line, those mean rate and rate at a specific time would be the exact same because the gradient is constant the whole way up. But with a curve, gradient changes. And when you get to A-level maths, etc., and you start to learn about differentiation, etc., there are other ways that you can calculate that. But what we're going to do is we're going to learn to draw a tangent. So the question says, calculate rate of reaction at 20 seconds. So what the first thing you need to do is draw a tangent at the specified time. So a tangent is a line that you draw against your curve, and the line should hit the curve at the time that the question is said. So here you can see that the line hits the curve at 20 seconds. Okay. Now it's difficult to be very, very accurate with this, but if you've made a good attempt, you will get marks in the exam. Also, the marks for this question tend to be a range, so even if you haven't got exactly what they asked for, they normally give it between this and this. So you have room for a little bit of error. Now, once you've drawn your line, you're then going to basically make it into a triangle. So you've got a tangent, and then you're going to draw the other sides and make it into a triangle. Now, the tangent is going to be your longest side, or your hypotenuse, if you are a fancy maths whiz. Which I'm not, but I just throw that in there. Now, you can then look at the lengths of your two sides. Now, you don't use a ruler to work out the lengths of these sides. You look it from the graph. So here, we've gone from 10 to 34. So that length is 24 seconds. And here, we've got 28 up to 48. So that's a difference of 20 centimetres cubed. So once I've got that information, well then I can go back to my graph. And change in gradient is the change in y divided by the change in x, the rise over tread. So I would then pop that information in. So as I worked out, the length of one line is 20 and the length of the other is 24. I pop that into my equation and I get an answer of 0.83. Now, if it were me, I would probably write the length of those lines on my triangle, just because I think it helps. I really do think it helps to see it very visually. Then you just need to remember that it's change in y divided by change in x. Now, like I say, if you're confused by this, go back to the beginning and watch this section again, and really try and understand how it happened. Because that is a higher question, which means that if you're going to get a question on rates of reaction, it could be on there because it's one of the only higher only content points for this particular bit of the topic. So let's have a go at some questions together, okay? So I'll make this up a bit bigger. There we go. Okay, so let's look at this question here. Now, first of all, we see a diagram. Excellent. And this is a diagram where they're measuring how much gas is being produced, and you should be able to work that out because you can see a gas syringe, and that gas syringe I showed you earlier. So a student investigated the effect of different catalysts on decomposition of hydrogen peroxide. Right, catalysts. What do we know about catalysts? Well, we know that catalysts increase the rate of reaction by increasing the number of particles at and above the activation energy because they lower the activation energy. So I've got that in my head. I might even write that on the question just to help me remember. Decomposition of hydrogen peroxide is just a reaction of hydrogen peroxide where it gets broken down. Not important for the question. So let's look at what they're actually asking us. So oxygen gas is produced. Table 5 shows the students' observations. So they have got different catalysts and then they've got different observations. So manganese dioxide, lots of gas, hydrogen peroxide bubbles up into the gas syringe itself. Potato, steady bubbles of gas being produced. Copper oxide, a few bubbles of gas. Sodium chloride, very few bubbles of gas. Which is the most useful catalyst? If you want to have a go at this, pause your answer, and if we were able to do this live in the webinar, I'd be saying pause now, have a go, and then we can come back to it. But I'll go through the answer in a second. Now, the first thing I want you to see is that this says explain your answer, so why you picked it. It's worth 2 marks. So you'll get 1 mark for the correct catalyst and another mark for your correct observation and explanation of your observation. Now, the best catalyst, if we just want to look at it really plainly, which one speeds up the reaction the best, is manganese dioxide, okay? It makes the reaction happen the most vigorously. But it bubbles so much that hydrogen peroxide itself gets into the gas syringe. That is going to make my experiment really unreliable, because by moving some of the liquid into the gas syringe, some of the gas is going to move elsewhere, and it's just unmanageable. It's also not very safe to have your products spewing everywhere. Potato is a good catalyst. You can see that by the steady bubbles of gas being produced. So I am producing a product at a steady rate. Copper oxide, yeah, it works, but very few bubbles of gas are produced. Sodium chloride, even worse. I mean, it may catalyse the reaction a little bit, but not as much as you would want to. So, what does the examiner actually say? Well, the answer is potato. And the reason the answer is potato is because it's effective, but it's also manageable and safe. If you did say manganese dioxide, and you said because it is the best catalyst, the most effective catalyst, you'd still get 1 mark, but you wouldn't get the 2. Okay, and that's because you need to identify practically, if you were using these 2 catalysts, which one would be best. Really nice 2 marker there. This one's a little bit more tricky, but it's a really important question I wanted to show you. So these are 3 different catalysts, and they have 3 shapes. And it says each catalyst has the same volume. Right, if it's saying to you they have the same volume, but there are 3 different shapes, then they are talking to us about surface area to volume ratio. So here, we're talking about catalysts, but really we're talking about surface area to volume ratio. And it is absolutely designed to throw you a bit. And that's why it's on the higher paper. So, you've got A, B and C. And the question says, evaluate the effectiveness of the shapes of catalyst in figure 3. Now, evaluate means compare and come to a conclusion. So, first of all, we need to think about which one has the highest surface area. Well, B definitely doesn't, does it? Because it's 1 block, the only available particles are on the outside. The next bit is whether A or C has a bigger surface area. And actually, the answer is C. Because C has these ridges, which allow much more of it to be exposed, and it's got the hole in the middle. So think about all of those particles that are available to be exposed. Both of those 2 features increase the surface area. Therefore, the best catalyst would be C. And it would be the best because it has the largest surface area to volume ratio because of the grooves and because of the hole in the middle. So let's see what the examiner wants us to say. Well, it says, the greatest surface area to volume ratio increases catalytic effectiveness. If you wrote, the best catalyst is C because it has the greatest surface area, 1 mark. Done. Okay? You get 2 marks from any 2 of these 3 things, or you can get it for similar as well. So the examiner does have some authority to give a mark for any correct answer. So smaller pellets give higher surface area to volume ratio. So if they were cut into smaller bits, they would give you a higher surface area to volume ratio. So I'm guessing that is kind of an explanation for why A might be a good catalyst. However, on C, the hole in the middle increases the surface area, and the ridges increase that surface area as well. Okay, so it's about describing why it's a better catalyst. So those are 2 questions that you may well be asked, and they are 2 of the harder ones, and I just wanted to include that in there for you. So, as we talked about at the beginning of this video, your task for this week, to watch this video, if you haven't watched the webinar, or if you have and would like to actually be able to finish it without being cut off, and complete the quiz. Okay, so pick up on key important bits. Session 2, rewatch the video if necessary and then complete the exam questions. Okay, they are on the sheet as normal. There are 2 questions where the mark scheme is given to you so that you can self-mark. I've been dead impressed with my own class who have been fantastic at marking their answers and then having a go underneath. I think they would tell you it's very useful in preparing them for the questions afterwards. And then, like I say, those questions afterwards, they will be marked by your teacher and they are worth a total of 15 marks, I believe, this time. Now, the last thing is there is an activity to write a method for one of the experiments to measure rate of reaction. It's optional, it's if you finish in time and you have time to go over it, but it is an extension. It'd be really great to see as many of you attempt it as possible. So thank you for watching. Thank you for taking part. Please do ask questions if you need help. Rewatch parts of this video if you need to, and good luck with all your tasks. Thank you, Year 10.